about the natural history of the Anoka sand plain, which is where our program is focused, and kind of what the problem is and what the opportunities are. So why we're working in the Anoka sand plain with the Rare Plant Species Conservation Program. So the Anoka sand plain is an ecological subsection, one of about 20 ecological subsections within Minnesota. It's on the screen here is it's in the north central metro area, labeled with the letter P. And next slide, please. It's about 1.1 million acres in size and has a population of about 5.3, or Minnesota, excuse me, has a population of about 5.3 million people. And many of these people are concentrated within the metro area. And the Anoka sand plain sits on the north end of the Twin Cities metropolitan area in east central Minnesota. Next slide. The Anoka sand plain is a large, like I said, million-acre glacial lake plain, and has a very complex history of natural history and geologic history. It is the result of several glacial episodes, probably the most important episode being the Grantsburg sublobe of the Des Moines lobe glacial event. And there were many, several episodes where the ice sheet would advance and then retreat in different directions. And that's what this is showing. And this all happened within the last maybe 12 to 15,000 years ago. Next slide. This diagram is a diagram that I made. It's an overlay of some of the most important kind of soils, the different counties, and then these three different glacial events. The oldest is Glacial Lake Lind, which is outlined in red, and that outletted into the Mississippi River corridor. And then the Glacial Lake Fridley, or Glacial Lake Anoka, it's labeled here, is the area in blue. And that was another event that outletted into the St. Croix River channel. And then the Glacial Lake Grantsburg is the third event outlined in green that formed kind of the northern part of the Anoka sand plain. And that also outletted into the St. Croix River Valley. Next slide. So this set up a former glacial lake basin that is very sandy in many places, and with all the fines outletting into these river channels and being deposited down in the Gulf of Mexico to the south, and the sands being left behind. And then within the furrows of the sand lake plain bottom, peatlands formed over the last maybe 4,000 to 6,000 years. And those areas here are highlighted in a hot pink color. Next slide. Associated with those peatlands are what was mapped as wet prairie systems. And so these are wet sedge lands, grasslands that were growing on these peat deposits that accumulated within these glacial furrows. And then surrounding that, those wet prairies and those peatlands was oak openings and barrens. So this was a completely fire-driven system, very complex in its microtopography and soils, and also in its kind of disturbance regimes. Next slide. This is kind of a cross section of what those soils look like. Soil Katina, that's the predominant kind of peatland to dry sand soil types. And the Zimmerman soils are up in the upper right-hand corner, those are the kind of well-drained and very developable soil types.
So we are missing some checks, I think.
The Isanti soils are these kind of wet to saturated benches that lead into these deeper furrows that are filled with rifle and marquee peatlands. Next slide. If you could mute, everyone could mute, that would be helpful. The hydrology of the sand plain is, even though the topography is very slight, the hydrology can be very complex, and even the also the water chemistry can be anything from from pH neutral to very acidic in the bogs, and then rich fens would be kind of a moderate acidity, a pH of 6 to 6.5. Next slide. Within the Anoka sand plain, there are 114 listed species known to occur. Many of these are vertebrates and invertebrates, but the majority are vascular plants. And this might be a little bit dated, but there's 31 endangered and threatened plants listed in the sand plain, and 18 of these occur within wetland systems. Next slide. And this is the endangered and threatened, not the special concern species from the NHIS, showing the relative concentration of rare and threatened and endangered species that occur within the Anoka sand plain. And then the relative distribution of those same species elsewhere. So it is a biodiversity hotspot and rare species hotspot within all of Minnesota, and then it happens to be on the north end of the metro area. So it's colliding with, or development is colliding with this high level of biodiversity. Next slide. This is a figure that I created, rare plants of Anoka sand plain shallow wetlands, which contain a majority of the rare plants, showing 11 endangered and 7 threatened plant species that are obligate to these these shallow wet peatland systems of the sand plain. Many additional special concern species, a few tracked species, and even a few species that we aren't quite sure what they are yet, a rubus species and a Lycopodiella species that might be Midwest endemics that aren't listed here. In addition to the rare plants of the wetlands, there are several additional very rare species of upland prairies, savannas, and forests, and those tend to be kind of fire-dependent species as well. And I know many of the species that are rare within the sand plain are associated with each other and are eastern coastal plain disjunct species. So they have migrated in from the east coast, from similar habitats at the east coast, and have are on the western and northern edge of their range in North America. Next slide. This is an example from a paper from Tony Rezinchik showing the disjunct nature of Xyris torta, one of the endangered species of the wetlands of the Anoka sand plain, showing concentrations around Lake Michigan, and then in the central sands region of Wisconsin, and then the northern and western edge of the range up in the Anoka sand plain and Creeks Meadows area of Burnett County, Wisconsin. And again, next slide, just another kind of diagram of a national distribution of Xyris torta, showing again that its relative rarity and how it's really dropping off in the northern and western edge of its range in Minnesota. And this is so typical of many of these species. The reason that they're rare, they were already rare prior to development and loss of habitat, but now they're becoming even more rare with those pressures. Next slide. And then this shows just a concentration of some of these different elements that I showed you with the rare plant locations in Anoka County. And as many of us know, Anoka County is high development pressure. It's the edge of the metropolitan urban sewer area, the Musa line. And so development is very intense, and it's overlapping with these high concentrations of rare features. Next slide. This is just kind of summarizes some of the aspects of these wet prairie and wet meadow and peatland habitats that of the Anoka sand plain. On one of our sites, the Blaine Preserve SNA, there's over 320 native species in a 60-acre remnant. So that's about 15% of the flora of Minnesota, including 12 listed species, all occurring within 60 acres. So it's a kind of off the charts diversity. Next slide. Some photographs of these habitats, these remnants. This is the Blaine Preserve SNA following a burn with a display of Laetris pycnostachya. Next slide. Yeah, I just have to wait for Carrie to come back.
Looks like Carrie stepped out for a minute. Oh, there she is.
Another remnant in Blaine, Minnesota, with some Native Plant Society members. This is now maybe 20 years ago, but showing the kind of relative diversity and even the low stature nature of a habitat remnant. And then this is about maybe 20 feet from a road edge. So, the development's going overlapping with these remnants. Next slide. They are fire dependent, and with fire suppression, we are losing the biodiversity of these remnants. Next slide. Another example of fire. Next slide. They were also dependent on wetland, on drawdown, on flooding and drawdown. And so with ditch systems that are incorporated within developing cities and municipalities, the flooding doesn't happen, and perhaps the drawdown is permanent. And so we don't have these natural cycles of flooding and drawdown either. So we're losing that disturbance regime as well. Next slide. This is an example of a fire managed area of Cedar Creek, and to the south is Helen Allison, which is somewhat fire managed, but it shows the changes in the plant communities and the plant community kind of matrix and patterns in a fire managed portion of the sand plain versus on either side of the road, no fire or less fire, and becomes quite brushy and quite wooded. And again, losing the biodiversity from that. Next slide. This is a stagnant kind of remnant of that same kind of pattern, with aspen and birch and other mesic species really occupying those really diverse transitions from the dry, kind of farmed and developed Zimmerman soils down to the open kind of herbaceous peaty areas. Next slide. And then here's an example of the Anoka County Airport where you've got the airport kind of developed right over this very complex lake bottom dune and swale kind of pattern that is fire suppressed and becoming quite woody and low diversity. Next slide. Another example of Carlos Avery, a very kind of wet end that is fire managed, but has these kind of wooded islands. Next slide. And then we're showing the development pressure. So within the center of this slide, this area is a very diverse remnant with remnant populations of very rare plants. You see a ditch coming, partially draining this wetland, and then you see this overlay of lots that are slamming right up against this. And this is where we're starting to kind of lose these remnant populations, the developments colliding with these rare plants and really creating a need for a rare plant rescue program. Next slide. This is an example of that same wetland. Here's the wetland that has the rare plants in it and the development footprint coming right up against that wetland. And then the only reason that this wetland here is so biodiverse and has the rare plants that it does is it was hayed every year for the last 20 years, where the rest of the wetland here has been left fallow. So even the species and the rare species are different just from the haying versus the fire suppression or haying suppression of the rest of the wetland. Next slide. And these are just some examples. This is of the Lexington Cove project where there was development that's gone in the last few years. Next slide. This just shows the complex soil profiles that really support these kind of wetland systems and this complex formation of wetlands and uplands. Next slide. And here's the rare habitat, the rare species habitat, rare plant populations adjacent to, right up to the development footprint. Next slide. And then this is one last example of a proposed, we did a survey just to the east of this last site called the Mill Pond proposed development, residential development, and documented landsleep violet and rubus semicytosis, 2 threatened species. And then the next slide, the development footprint showing ultimately the take of almost all of these plants directly by the proposed development footprint. And then the next slide is the rare plant take permit that allowed for the taking of these plants by paying mitigation payment to the Minnesota DNR, which is meant to advance the conservation and proliferation of these same species on other sites that are not impacted by development. So that's been generally the model of take and mitigation up until now. And the general understanding and the application of the rare plant rules and statutes are that mitigation is handled still through the payment of to the DNR for the taking of the plants, and that once the plants are permitted for take, up until recently, that they would be destroyed on site. And so we recognized an opportunity in working with the DNR over the past many years to come up with an alternative approach that once the plants were permitted for take and paid for, that we might use them experimentally to try to rescue them, salvage them, and move them to protected sites to learn more about their natural history, their life history requirements, and their ability to be moved, and also develop a network of professionals and citizen scientists and volunteers that could respond in real time and move these, salvage these plants and move them. And so that's where I'm going to hand this over to Carrie, and we're going to talk, she's going to talk more with Amanda about the program and what it entails. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So Jason mentioned that the take permit. And so basically, there is a permit for that. There's mitigation fees, but there is this window of time after that take permit and before construction begins, where we are trying to get in that small window of time or window and take the plants and move them out of the donor site. We're calling it the donor site. It's the development site, and then move them either to the protected site or to the arboretum for holding. And we are allowed to do that now because in 2019, the Minnesota DNR started a new permit program. So before 2019, there was a process for development and for the take permit. There was also a research permit, which the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum has done rare plant research in the past with the research permit. But this is a different permit that allows us to propagate plants and move them and put them back onto the landscape. So because of this opportunity, we joined partners with Critical Connections and with the Conservation District in Anoka, where we see a lot of development happening, and then experts in the field at the plant conservation program at the Arboretum. We've started in 2019 once that permit was available by the DNR, and we applied for funding and recently got funding in 2021 from Outdoor Heritage Fund. So the main goal of the program that we are still working to develop is to rescue rare plants that would otherwise be destroyed. And then because we have these plants and we have this plant material, we want to take the opportunity to advance our understanding of the rare plant species and their conservation. So there's a lot of steps in that process of rescuing plants. And that's partly why we put on this presentation to invite you to be part of these actions. So basically we find out if there's going to be plans for an unavoidable rare plant impact. Ideally, we would have notice of that. And then we would evaluate the site conditions, the donor site, the development site, and based on which plants are there, we then try to find a recipient site and then determine our methods and how we're going to move those plants. And so in order to move the plants, sorry about that. In order to move the plants, we need a group of people to work with us to move them. And then we move them either to directly to a recipient site, a protected site, or we move them temporarily to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. Once they're moved and planted, then of course we also want to monitor them and refine our approach and continue that process. Oh, let's see, sorry about that. Okay, so today we're working on, one of our objectives is just building that network. And I'm sure many of you can plug into the different parts of that, that flow with the rescue. So one of the things we need to do is to identify more recipient sites, either through modeling or from information that and then we do habitat assessments on sites. We are working on building protocols for our rescues and our transplants and doing propagation experiments to make those transplants more successful. And then we're also developing monitoring goals and protocols. And we're tracking all of this into a geodatabase, which then we share with the DNR so they know where these experimental plots are. We are doing some seed banking with the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum for long-term conservation and working on kind of pulling all of this information together in conservation plans. And then we'll share that information as we have it. So in order to meet these goals, we do need to build more partnerships and collaborations. So if you are a private landowner with a conservation easement, or if you are a public land manager and you have sites where you are actively managing, we would like to connect with you to find if there's suitable habitat for some of these rare species. If you're a part of the permitting process, we'd like to communicate with you if you know that there might potentially be some take permits on some sites, or if you are a city planner and you're considering, ways of planning or developing, we could work with you. Or if you, give us notice for potential development in the future, then that helps us kind of get prepared for these rescues and transplanting. And then obviously this takes a lot of labor. So if you are able to volunteer and come out and move plants, or if you want to do some aftercare or do some monitoring, we need that help as well. So we are, as we build this program, we are considering some of the potential negative implications of this. So we're like Jason said, this program does not replace the mitigation that is involved with a take permit. So the take permit, that mitigation is to do enhancement for species on different sites. We have it, our program is a separate permit, and we're moving plants and so far this is just an experiment. So we don't know the success of these transplants. We are thoughtful of where we move the plants. We've mostly moved plants within 10 miles of where we've dug them up. And we're also careful to not destroy the sites where we are moving plants into, which we're calling the recipient sites. So far, since 2019, we've salvaged plants or seeds from 7 development sites, and we've transplanted at least 9,000 rare plants to protected sites. We've also collected seed from some development sites, and we've collected 22 endangered, threatened, or special concern Anoka sandplain species for long-term seed banking. And we're working on propagation experiments and planting experiments just to try to increase the success of our work. So this is a map of most of our donor sites. We did actually have a rescue yesterday, so I haven't put that dot on the map yet, but this is in Anoka County. You can see this is kind of zoomed in on Blaine. There's a lot of development happening in Blaine, Minnesota right now, but there's also Lina Lakes on the southeast corner of the map. But this is where we have been working so far. So in advance of a rescue, we do get permission from the landowner or the developer to dig out the plants, and the landowners have been really great to work with. They've been understanding that they're still doing the mitigation payments for the take permit, but they have been allowing us to come and take the plants and dig them up. So then once we know what plants we're going to work with, of course, then we determine the recipient sites that they're, that would be good homes to them. And we set up plots so that we can track them over time. So during the rescue, we work with volunteers. It takes a lot of work, a lot of people. So we're really grateful for all the volunteers who come out, oftentimes on very short notice. And volunteers work with us to dig up the plants and then remove any weedy plants. We don't, one of our goals is we do not want to move weeds or jumping worms to nice sites. So we're very careful on processing the plants. And then we try, it's ideal to move them that same day to a protected site. And then we monitor them annually to assess the survivorship, the phenology, and the recruitment of the rare plants. And it's really helpful to have the volunteers, and we'd love to have volunteers help us with monitoring too. So in some cases, we have collected seed instead of plants. This, for instance, this Aristida longispica is an annual, so it makes more sense to collect the seed. And we are also we've worked with a fair amount of rubus species, and so we've dug out whole plants, but we've also found that, taking cuttings during certain times of year are it's more beneficial just to potentially take cuttings. So we've also done that. So in some cases, like I said, we try to take plants straight to a protected site, but that's not always an option. And so the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum Plant Conservation Program has a group of volunteers that they've been working with, and they have also put some attention to this project to help clean and count and process plants. And the Arboretum has the facility to store plants if we have to store them before we can move them to a protected site. So especially in the heat of the summer, we did move some plants, but we also directly on a day for one rescue, and then we also put plants at the Arboretum. And waited to move into the fall. And the Arboretum has the facilities to keep things alive until maybe it's a better time to grow. And I have this picture, it's not the greatest, but this is we just saw this yesterday. It's one of the plants that got planted last year. And so there is some life coming back up from our transplants. So in addition to, rescuing the rare plants, which is, the primary goal of this program, we are also trying to learn about the plants and learn how to effectively move things and propagate things. So if we can find quality habitat or get a site and enhance the site and get it ready for rare plants, then we can figure out the most effective way to get plants propagated and moved into the ground. So the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum is also working on a couple of different propagation experiments. One was done last year with the rubus species, and rubus have floricanes and primicanes. So last year there were cuttings of primicanes. And then this year we'll do another round of experiments with the floricanes. And so we're monitoring, different experiments or different propagation methods. So our next steps is potentially, some of our thoughts, but we're also here to have this webinar to get your feedback and, get your suggestions. But we are working on gathering the information we've gathered so far into plant conservation plans, just to identify some gaps in rare species biology, ecology, and management needs. And then that can also help guide some questions that we have and potentially guide how we set up our transplant plot design. And then over time, we'll be able to analyze the results of these transplants between different sites and, the different management approaches on each of these sites and, the different hydrology and soils. And then we could potentially provide some management plans for some of the rare species. And then over time, we'll continue to do more propagation experiments with different species as the rescues happen. And we would love to train other staff. I work for the Anoka Conservation District, but there's other conservation district staff that we'd like to get involved. If you see a development happening or if you're aware of sites that could be recipient sites, we'd like to start engaging and expand the program. So I guess that's kind of where I'm leaving it open for just more of a call out of that's the big goal of this presentation is the collaboration and partnerships that we build will then help really meet those goals of rescuing more rare plants from development sites and and expand our knowledge on rare plant conservation. This work can be streamlined and more efficient if we had collaboration and partnership and just communication. So if you during this presentation, and if you have a position somewhere in those steps of the process, we'd love to hear from you and see how we can work with you to make that process run more effectively. So I guess that gives us some time where I will stop sharing my screen and we can open it up to questions.